Chidinma lay on the wet concrete of the compound, the heavy rain of late July soaking through her thin cotton wrapper. She was 8 months pregnant. Her hands instinctively curled around her swollen stomach, shielding the child from the cold wind that swept through the iron gates. She did not scream. She did not beg. She had learned, over the 3 years she had lived under Sylvester's roof, that screaming only made the beatings last longer. What Sylvester did not know, what he would not discover until the destruction of his entire life was already complete, was that the mute beggar Chidinma was about to feed in the market was Obinna, the billionaire CEO of Eagle Crest Industries, and the architect of his absolute ruin. The front door of the house remained open, casting a warm, dry rectangle of light onto the flooded pavement. Gladys, her mother-in-law, stood on the porch with her arms crossed over a tailored silk blouse. The smell of expensive fried rice and roasted meat drifted out from the kitchen, a sharp contrast to the metallic scent of wet rust and mud that Chidinma was breathing in. Sylvester stepped past his mother. He held Chidinma's only travel bag, a cheap, fraying canvas tote, and threw it effortlessly into the puddles near her feet. "You eat my bread?" Sylvester said, his voice easily cutting through the sound of the rain. "You sleep on my mattress. And still, you produce nothing but a mouth to feed and a belly full of another useless mouth." Chidinma pushed herself up to her knees. The gravel bit into her skin. "My mother has already chosen your replacement," Sylvester continued, adjusting the collar of his dry, perfectly pressed shirt. "Vivian comes from a family that builds empires. You come from a family that washes clothes. Charity has expiration dates. Yours ran out tonight." The heavy iron gate slammed shut. The metallic clang vibrated through the soles of Chidinma's bare feet. The words did not wound her in the way he intended. They landed instead on an older bruise, the one her late father had left when he died with nothing to his name. Apologizing with his final breath for leaving her unprotected in a world that measured blood by bank accounts. Sylvester thought he was breaking her spirit, but he was only stripping away the illusion of her safety. A woman who knows she has nothing left to lose is no longer a victim. She is a variable. That night, long after the wealthy estates had gone quiet, Chidinma walked. The street lights of the affluent neighborhood flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the high-security walls, topped with electrified wire. She walked past iron gates and manicured hedges, the scent of wet jasmine hanging heavy in the cool air. Soon the paved roads gave way to uneven dirt paths. The streetlights vanished. The rain did not stop. It plastered her hair to her skull and turned the red earth of the roadside into a slippery, dragging weight against her cracked heels. She carried the canvas bag over one shoulder, her other hand supporting the heavy, tightening weight of her child. Every step required a negotiation with her own exhaustion. Her throat tightened until swallowing felt like forcing down a stone. The chill of the night seeped deep into her joints, but she forced one foot in front of the other. By the time the sky began to bleed into the dull gray of morning, she reached the outskirts of Balagan Market. The market was waking up, groaning to life with the harsh sounds and smells of survival. The air hung thick with the heavy odor of fermenting cassava, rotting cabbage leaves, and the sharp, salty sting of dried stockfish. Okada riders honked their horns impatiently, their tires splashing thick brown water onto the shins of weary hawkers. Chidinma found a narrow overhang near a row of closed fabric stalls. She sank onto a discarded wooden crate, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her stomach contracted with a sharp pang of hunger. Inside her bag she had one half loaf of ageg bread. It was damp, slightly crushed, but it was all she owned. She pulled it out. Before she could take a bite, a shadow fell over her. An old man was sweeping the flooded gutter a few feet away. He walked with a severe limp, dragging his left leg as if the bone had healed incorrectly years ago. His clothes were little more than rags, stained black with grease and gutter water. He did not speak. He merely looked at the bread in her hand, his eyes hollow with a starvation that Chidinma recognized instantly. She did not look away in disgust. She broke the damp bread in half and held out the larger piece. The old man hesitated, then reached out with a trembling, calloused hand to take it. He bowed his head, making a low, guttural sound in his throat. He was mute. If Sylvester had been there, he would have kicked the man into the gutter for daring to stand so close. But what neither Sylvester nor the arrogant market managers collecting bribes, just 3 stalls down, could possibly comprehend was the truth hidden beneath those filthy rags. The mute, crippled sweeper was not a beggar. He was Obinna, 12 miles away, on the top floor of a glass tower where the air conditioning hummed in absolute silence and the air smelled of imported leather. His executive chair sat empty. He was the owner of Eagle Crest Industries. He had recently purchased the land beneath Balogun Market through a shell corporation, and he was standing in the mud, disguised and silent, personally documenting the extortion rings bleeding the vendors dry. Chidinma ate her small piece of bread slowly, chewing until the starch dissolved completely, trying to trick her stomach into feeling full. Her jaw locked as another cramp seized her lower back. A single vein pulsed at her temple. She closed her eyes, forcing her breathing to slow, focusing entirely on the rhythm of the rain hitting the corrugated zinc roof above them. The mute sweeper sat on an overturned bucket across the narrow alley. He ate the bread with quiet dignity, never taking his eyes off her. He watched the way she guarded her stomach, the way she endured the cold without a single whimper of complaint. In Obinna's world, people complained when their champagne was served at the wrong temperature. Here was a woman, visibly abandoned, heavily pregnant, who had just surrendered half her survival to a stranger who could offer her absolutely nothing in return. "Thank you," she whispered softly, her voice raspy from the cold. The sweeper tilted his head, a silent question. "For sitting with me?" Chidinma clarified. "It is quiet." It was a profound statement in a place as chaotic as Balogun Market. But the quiet she spoke of was not the absence of noise. It was the absence of cruelty. Her gratitude unsettled him. It bypassed the elaborate armor Obinna had spent a decade building against the sycophants and corporate predators of Lagos. He had come to the market expecting to find thieves and victims, predators and prey. He had not prepared himself to find grace sitting on a rotting crate. Some men spend their entire lives searching for a profitable investment. Obinna realized, watching the rain drip from her eyelashes, that he had just found the only investment worth protecting. The morning fully broke, harsh and unforgiving. The market women arrived with their heavy basins of vegetables and meats. The noise swelled into a deafening roar of haggling, shouting, and the constant thud of heavy boots on wet pavement. Chidinma stood up slowly. Her legs trembled, but she forced her knees to lock. She had to find a corner that was dry. She had to figure out how to survive the next 24 hours. She picked up her fraying canvas bag and began to walk deeper into the maze of stalls. The sweeper did not follow her. He merely picked up his broom, gripping the wooden handle with hands that routinely signed contracts worth billions of naira, and went back to sweeping the gutter. He had seen enough for one morning. By noon the following day, the suffocating heat of the Lagos sun had turned the damp aisles of Balogun Market into a steaming trench of humanity. The red earth baked, trapping the metallic scent of butchered meat and the heavy, sweet rot of overripe plantains. Chidinma navigated the narrow pathways between the stalls, moving with the slow, deliberate caution required of a woman carrying an 8-month pregnancy on an empty stomach. Her bare feet were coated in dried mud. A cold sweat pooled at the base of her neck, and her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that radiated down her thighs. She found a discarded wooden table in a forgotten corner of the market, wedged between a mountain of broken plastic crates and a foul-smelling drainage ditch. Half of the table's legs were missing, propped up unevenly by cinder blocks, and a frayed blue tarp hung precariously overhead. It was a pathetic shelter, a place where stray dogs usually curled up to die, but Chidinma claimed it. She swept the debris away with a piece of dried palm frond and sat on a plastic bucket, resting her back against the rough cinder block wall. She did not weep for the air-conditioned bedroom she had lost. She simply conserved her energy, calculating how to stretch her remaining half-loaf of bread over the next 48 hours. Meanwhile, on the other side of the market, a very different kind of survival was taking place. A heavy, unnatural silence began to ripple through the main trading avenue. The chaotic symphony of haggling and shouting died down, replaced by the hasty scraping of wooden benches and the fearful shuffling of feet. The tax collectors had arrived. Sylvester walked down the center of the muddy path, as though he were strolling through a private garden. He wore a crisp, tailored linen suit that repelled the humidity, and the sharp, expensive scent of his imported cologne sliced right through the odor of the open gutters. Beside him walked his mother, Gladys, draped in vibrant, heavy lace, her wrists adorned with thick bands of solid gold that clinked softly with every step. They were not official government workers. They were the self-appointed lords of this district, collecting illegal protection fees from the market women with ruthless efficiency. Behind them trailed two large men with thick wooden batons, enforcing the hierarchy of the streets. "Pay up, Mama Nkechi," Sylvester demanded, stopping before a woman selling smoked fish. The vendor, her hands trembling, handed over a wad of crumpled Naira notes. Sylvester did not even count it. He slipped it into his pocket and kicked the leg of her wooden stand just hard enough to make the baskets of fish wobble dangerously. It was not about the money. It was about the performance of power. Gladys sneered, adjusting the silk wrap on her head. "Make sure you have double next week," she warned the vendor, "or we take your spot and give it to someone who knows how to work." They continued their patrol, terrorizing the vegetable sellers and the fabric merchants, moving steadily toward the forgotten corners of the market. Sylvester was smiling, bloated with the petty authority he wielded over the desperate, until he turned the corner near the plastic crates and stopped dead. The smile evaporated. The blood left his face, replaced by a dark, creeping flush of outrage. Chidinma was sitting under the frayed blue tarp. She had managed to scavenge a few discarded sweet potatoes from the alleys, wiping the dirt from them with the edge of her wrapper, carefully arranging them on the broken table in a meager attempt to start a trade. Sylvester marched toward her, his Italian leather shoes stepping carelessly into the mud. He stopped inches from her table, towering over her. "You come to my market to display your wretchedness?" Sylvester asked, his voice dripping with venom. "You sleep in the mud like a pig and try to shame me in front of the people I control?" Chidinma did not look up immediately. She finished wiping the last potato, placing it gently beside the others. Her heartbeat moved into her ears, a loud, steady drum, but her hands did not shake. "Your mother was a washerwoman," Gladys hissed, stepping up beside her son and pointing a gold-ringed finger at Chidinma's face. "Your grandmother was a washerwoman. What exactly did you think you were going to achieve by squatting in the filth? People like you do not belong anywhere near our family. You are a decoration of failure." "Look at her," Sylvester sneered, gesturing to her swollen stomach. 3 years I waited for an heir, and you squat here in the dirt, proving exactly what you are. A parasite waiting for charity. Who will come for you now? The orphanage that raised you?" Chidinma lifted her chin slowly, her jaw locked. She looked directly into Sylvester's eyes, bypassing the cruelty, observing only the deep, pathetic insecurity that required him to shout at a pregnant woman to feel like a man. "I heard you the first time," Chidinma said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried absolute clarity. Sylvester's jaw tightened. The words did not grant him the victory he sought. He wanted her to cry. He wanted her to fall to her knees and beg him to take her back, to prove to his mother and the watching market vendors that he was a god who held her life in his hands. By refusing to break, Chidinma had denied him his worship. Her quiet composure was a mirror reflecting his own smallness, and he hated her for it. Some men require the destruction of others to build their own pedestals. When the victim refuses to shatter, the pedestal crumbles. In a sudden, violent motion, Sylvester kicked the broken table. The wood cracked. The table flipped over, sending the few sweet potatoes rolling into the foul, muddy drainage ditch. "If I see you here tomorrow," Sylvester warned, leaning down so his face was inches from hers, "I will have my boys drag you out by your hair." He turned on his heel and walked away, Gladys following closely behind, her golden bracelets clinking like a cruel, rhythmic laughter. Chidinma did not move. She waited until their expensive cologne faded into the stench of the market. Then, with agonizing slowness, she lowered herself to the muddy ground. She reached her hands into the black sludge of the ditch and began to retrieve her sweet potatoes, one by one. The cold water soaked into the sleeves of her wrapper. She wiped the black slime off the potatoes using the dry patches of her skirt. 12 feet away, standing in the shadows of an alleyway, the mute sweeper watched. Obinna gripped the wooden handle of his broom. His knuckles were white, the muscles in his jaw corded with tension. He had watched the entire exchange. He had heard every word Sylvester had spoken, had seen the violent kick, had observed the absolute, glacial restraint of the pregnant woman kneeling in the mud. He committed the faces of Sylvester and Gladys to his flawless memory. The ledger inside his mind, the one he kept for the inevitable reckoning, had just recorded its most damning entry. He did not rush forward to help her up. He knew that stepping in now would only expose his presence and rob her of the quiet dignity she was fiercely maintaining. Instead, he watched her stack the muddy potatoes back onto the overturned crate. He watched the way she touched her stomach, a silent promise to the child within. Obinna turned back to the gutter. He dragged his left leg, continuing his charade, sweeping the trash with slow, methodical strokes. But the billionaire was no longer just investigating corruption. He was engineering a massacre. Days slowly turned into weeks. The unforgiving rhythm of Balagan Market absorbed Chidinma into its chaotic, suffocating machinery. The oppressive heat of the dry season baked the red earth into cracked, unyielding stone, trapping the heavy scents of diesel exhaust, overripe fruit, and open sewage in the stagnant air. She survived by roasting discarded sweet potatoes over a small charcoal fire, earning just enough coins to buy a daily cup of gari and a sachet of clean water. Her body betrayed her constantly. Her ankles swelled until the dark skin grew tight and shiny, and the dull, relentless throb in her lower back became a permanent companion, anchoring her to the physical reality of her suffering. Yet, she did not stop. She swept the dirt around her broken table. She tended to her small fire. She endured the passing sneers of the other vendors who had absorbed Gladys's cruel narratives, treating Chidinma as a cursed pariah. Through it all, the mute sweeper remained a constant peripheral presence. He dragged his left leg through the flooded gutters and swept the refuse of the market with methodical, grueling precision. He never approached her for conversation, but he was always close enough to intercept the worst of the market's chaos before it reached her corner. One particular afternoon, the sky bruised a deep purple, and the suffocating heat broke into a sudden, torrential downpour. Rain hammered the corrugated zinc roofs with a deafening roar, turning the dirt aisles into rushing. Chidinma scrambled to pull her frayed blue tarp over her small charcoal stove, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts as a sharp contraction tightened across her abdomen. The sweeper emerged from the curtain of rain. He did not seek shelter in the crowded arcades where the other laborers huddled. Instead, he limped toward Chidinma's isolated corner and stood silently under the very edge of her tarp, his broad shoulders shielding her fire from the driving wind. Chidinma wiped the rainwater from her eyes. She picked up a warm roasted potato from the edge of the grill and held it out to him. He looked at the food, then at her hands. The skin of her knuckles was raw and blistered from the heat of the coals, her fingernails caked with damp ash and red mud. Obinna reached into the deep pocket of his grease-stained trousers. He did not pull out a dirty rag. He pulled out a small, perfectly folded square of white cotton handkerchief, incongruously pristine against the filth of his clothing. He offered it to her, a silent instruction to clean her wounds. As his arm extended, the cuff of his oversized, ragged shirt caught on his wrist and slid backward. For a fraction of a second, The ambient gray light of the storm caught the metal. It was a thick, heavy band of solid platinum resting securely on his right index finger. Engraved into the flat surface of the metal was the unmistakable crest of a soaring eagle gripping a diamond. What Sylvester could not have known, and what Obinna himself did not realize he had just exposed, was that Chidinma had spent 3 years meticulously cleaning Sylvester's home office. She had dusted the financial magazines and corporate dossiers featuring that exact corporate logo on their covers. She knew precisely what that crest meant, and she knew that street sweepers in Balogun Market did not wear custom platinum signet rings belonging to the executive board of Eagle Crest Industries. She took the cloth from his hand. Her fingers brushed his rough palm. The revelation did not make her pulse race. It did not send her begging for salvation or whispering rapid questions. It landed quietly inside her mind, a heavy, solid truth sliding into its designated slot. She understood instantly that the man standing beside her in the rain was not a victim of circumstance, but an architect of ruin wearing the skin of prey. He was watching the market just as she watched Sylvester. The sight of that ring confirmed that the ground beneath her husband's feet was already hollow, waiting for the command to collapse. Silence is the greatest weapon of the dispossessed, and she chose to wield it flawlessly. "Thank you," she said, her voice perfectly even. She wiped the ash from her hands, keeping her eyes fixed deliberately on the charcoal fire. She allowed him to believe his disguise was intact. It cost her nothing. The rain eventually slowed to a drizzle, but the tension in the market did not dissipate. Later that evening, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed down the narrow alleyway. 2 of Sylvester's enforcers, large men wearing thick gold chains and carrying wooden batons, swaggered through the puddles, collecting the end-of-day tolls from the straggling vendors. They spotted the sweeper standing near the drainage ditch. "You," the taller enforcer barked, pointing his baton at Obinna. "You have been sweeping this block for 3 weeks. Where is your operational fee?" Obinna turned slowly. He did not lower his head. He looked at the enforcer with a gaze so cold, so entirely devoid of fear, that the thug instinctively hesitated. But pride in front of the watching market women quickly overrode the enforcer's hesitation. "Are you deaf as well as dumb?" the thug shouted, stepping forward and kicking Obinna's plastic bucket into the ditch. "I asked you for the money." The enforcer raised his heavy wooden baton, preparing to strike the old man across the collarbone. A shadow moved rapidly across the wet pavement. Chidinma stepped directly between the descending baton and the disguised billionaire. She positioned her swollen stomach as a physical shield, forcing the enforcer to halt his swing mere inches from her face. "He works for me," Chidinma said. Her voice did not tremble. It dropped into a flat, dead calm that echoed off the cinder block walls. "He clears the ash from my fire. He has no money. If you want to strike someone, strike me, and explain to Sylvester why his unborn child is bleeding in the mud over a sweeper's toll." The enforcer's jaw clenched. A vein pulsed visibly in his thick neck. He looked at her stomach, then at the unwavering defiance in her eyes. He knew Sylvester despised this woman, but he also knew that drawing blood from a heavily pregnant woman in the middle of a crowded market would attract the wrong kind of attention from the local police, disrupting their extortion racket. "You are nothing but a madwoman guarding trash," the enforcer spat, lowering the baton slowly. He pointed a thick finger at Obinna. "Keep your dog on a leash, or I will break his remaining good leg." The thugs turned and marched away, splashing dirty water onto the hem of Chidinma's wrapper. Chidinma did not move until they disappeared around the corner. She exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders in a shuddering wave. She turned back to her broken table and began to pack away her remaining potatoes. Behind her, Obinna stood in absolute stillness. The CEO of Eagle Crest Industries, a man capable of crushing the enforcers, destroying Sylvester, and leveling the entire market with a single phone call, had just been physically protected by a homeless, discarded woman. She had placed her body between violence and a stranger, expecting no reward, asking for no recognition. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The curve of her spine, the quiet dignity of her movements, the absolute resilience forged in the fires of systematic cruelty. The investigation into the market's corruption was no longer just a corporate cleanup operation. It had become a deeply personal mandate. The storm was coming, and Obinna knew exactly Hameo's going to survive it. As the weeks went by, the brutal reality of Balagan Market stripped away whatever remained of Chidinma's former life, replacing it with the raw, mechanical instinct of survival. Her pregnancy advanced into its final month, turning her own body into a heavy, cumbersome cage. The child pressed low against her pelvis, making every step a grueling negotiation with gravity. The dry season had settled over Lagos with a vengeance, pulling all moisture from the air and leaving behind a suffocating, dusty heat that coated the skin in a fine layer of red grit. Chidinma spent her days tending the small charcoal stove beneath her broken table. The heat of the coals radiated against her swollen stomach, blistering the skin of her hands and filling her lungs with the sharp, metallic taste of gray smoke. She did not complain. She simply turned the sweet potatoes with a blackened stick, her face an unreadable mask of endurance. The mute sweeper remained in her periphery. He never acknowledged the day she had shielded him from the enforcer's baton, and she never spoke of the platinum eagle crest ring she had seen on his finger. They existed in a silent, mutually understood orbit. He dragged his broom through the gutters, and she roasted her potatoes. Two displaced figures, guarding secrets that were powerful enough to level the entire commercial district. One particular afternoon, the suffocating atmosphere of the market was pierced by the sharp, unnatural sound of expensive Italian leather clicking against the uneven pavement. Sylvester was parading through the market aisles, but he was not alone. Gladys walked to his right, fanning herself with a woven palm frond, her thick neck glistening with sweat despite her expensive silk wrapper. To his left walked Vivian. Vivian was a striking contrast to the grime of Balagan. She wore a pristine, cream-colored linen dress that seemed entirely immune to the humidity. Her hair was styled in elaborate, flawless waves, and the heavy scent of imported French vanilla perfume preceded her, momentarily cutting through the market's stench of dried stockfish and open drainage. She was the daughter of a prominent construction magnate, the prize Sylvester had discarded Chidinma to claim. They were inspecting the stalls, assessing the domain Sylvester now managed with iron-fisted cruelty. Vivian stepped carefully, her manicured fingers pinching the bridge of her nose to block out the foul air. As they rounded the corner toward the discarded plastic crates, Vivian stopped. Her eyes fell upon Chidinma, who was sitting on the overturned bucket, wiping soot from her forehead with the back of a blistered hand. "Sylvester, what is that?" Vivian asked, her voice carrying the high nasal pitch of a woman who had never known a day of hunger. "Why do they allow pregnant beggars to squat so close to the main thoroughfare? It is entirely unsanitary." Sylvester's posture stiffened. The arrogance he wore so comfortably slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a dark, furious embarrassment. Gladys stepped forward, her gold bracelets clinking loudly as she pointed at Chidinma. "Do not pity her, Vivian," Gladys sneered, making sure her voice was loud enough for the neighboring vendors to hear. "That is the trash my son mercifully swept out of our home. You are looking at a woman who thought she could infect our bloodline with her poverty." Chidinma did not look up from the charcoal fire. A single drop of sweat rolled down her temple, her jaw locked, the muscles pulling tight beneath her skin. Sylvester stepped closer, his shadow falling over Chidinma's small, pathetic display of roasted potatoes. He looked down at her swollen stomach, his eyes entirely devoid of humanity. "Look at her, Vivian," Sylvester said, his tone shifting into a mocking, theatrical pity. "This is the reality of her pedigree. Who will come for you now, Chidinma? Your dead parents? The orphanage that raised you? You have no one. That is not a tragedy. That is a market position." "She is taking up space," Vivian added, stepping behind Sylvester and crossing her arms. "She is a blight on your management, Sylvester." Have security remove her. Charity has expiration dates, Gladys spat, leaning down to ensure her words struck with maximum precision. You were nothing but a project, Chidinma, a stray dog we took pity on. And now, you belong exactly where stray dogs die, in the dirt. The words were designed to obliterate. They were precision strikes aimed at the deepest, most vulnerable architecture of Chidinma's identity. Her lack of family, her financial destitution, and her physical helplessness. The insults did not break her. They landed on a mind that had already accepted the absolute worst of human nature and moved past it. The words echoed in her ears, but they did not reach her heart, because her heart was no longer seeking their validation. Chidinma slowly raised her head. She looked at Vivian's pristine dress, then at Sylvester's expensive suit, and finally at Gladys's sneering face. She saw the desperation behind their cruelty, the exhausting, hollow effort required to maintain their fragile superiority. Chidinma knew, with the quiet certainty of the ring she had seen on the sweeper's hand, that the ground beneath these three people was already laced with explosives. They were dancing on their own graves, entirely unaware that the gravedigger was sweeping the dirt just 20 feet away. There is no need to strike a match when the house is already engulfed in invisible flames. I heard you the first time, Chidinma said quietly. She did not raise her voice. She did not break eye contact. Sylvester's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The absence of her tears infuriated him. He opened his mouth to shout, to order his enforcers to drag her away, but Vivian tugged urgently on his sleeve. Leave it, Sylvester, Vivian complained, turning her face away from the smoke of the charcoal fire. The smell is ruining my clothes. Let us go. Sylvester glared at Chidinma for one long, venomous second before turning on his heel. The trio walked away, their imported perfumes trailing behind them, leaving the heavy stench of the market to rush back into the space they vacated. 20 feet away, standing near a rusted iron pillar, Obinna tightened his grip on his broom handle. He had heard every word. The specific, calculated cruelty of the attack registered in his mind with forensic clarity. They had not just insulted her poverty, they had weaponized her orphan status. They had turned her isolation into a punchline. Obinna's eyes tracked Sylvester's retreating back, measuring the man's arrogant stride. The billionaire did not feel a sudden, hot burst of anger. He felt the cold, absolute zero of a judge who had just finalized a death sentence. Obinna looked back at Chidinma. She was breathing slowly, her hands resting protectively over her child, her eyes fixed on the retreating figures with glacial stillness. She had not begged, she had not shattered, she had simply absorbed the blow and remained intact. The investigation was officially over. Obinna had gathered enough evidence of the extortion ring to send Sylvester to prison for a decade, but prison suddenly seemed entirely inadequate. A man like Sylvester did not fear the law, he feared irrelevance. He feared losing the false empire he had built on the backs of the vulnerable. Obinna pulled the brim of his filthy hat lower over his eyes and went back to sweeping the market floor. The silent reclamation was about to begin. The furious energy of Balagan Market did not simply evaporate when the sun went down. It mutated. The deafening roar of haggling vendors and honking motorcycles gave way to a heavier, more dangerous frequency. The air cooled slightly, but the humidity remained, trapping the day's stench of rotting vegetables and diesel fumes close to the muddy earth. Feral cats darted between abandoned wooden stalls, and the low murmurs of men who operated exclusively in the dark drifted from the deeper alleys. For Chidinma, the night was not a time of rest. It was a prolonged, agonizing battle of endurance. She sat huddled beneath her frayed blue tarp, her back pressed against the rough cinder block wall. The physical toll of the last few weeks had pushed her body to the absolute edge of human capacity. Her ankles were so swollen that the skin felt tight enough to split. A relentless, grinding ache radiated from her lower lumbar spine, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Inside her, the child kicked with a sharp, frantic energy, a visceral reminder of the life she was entirely responsible for keeping tethered to the world. She rested her blistered, ash-stained hands on her stomach, rubbing slow, soothing circles over the tight fabric of her wrapper. The memory of the afternoon played through her mind with vivid clarity. Sylvester's immaculate linen suit, Vivian's imported French perfume cutting through the odor of the drainage ditch, Gladys's gold bracelets clinking like a death knell. She dissected the encounter not with sorrow, but with the cold, analytical precision of a survivor. They had come to the market specifically to witness her destruction. A man who is truly powerful does not need to parade his new bride in front of his destitute ex-wife. A woman who is truly secure in her wealth does not need to shout insults at a beggar. Sylvester and Gladys were not projecting strength. They were projecting a desperate, hollow panic. They required Chidinma to break, to weep, to beg for their mercy, because her submission was the only mortar that held their fragile illusions of superiority together. By refusing to give them her tears, Chidinma had effectively starved them. She had looked at the architects of her suffering and recognized them for what they truly were, cowards hiding behind expensive fabric. The realization did not numb the physical pain in her back or fill her empty stomach, but it fortified the architecture of her mind. They could break her body with the elements, but they no longer had access to her spirit. 3 streets away, entirely removed from the squalor of the market, a heavily armored, custom black Mercedes SUV idled silently in a dark private alley. The heavy, soundproof door opened. Obinna stepped inside, bringing with him the faint, sour smell of the market gutters. The contrast was violently abrupt. The interior of the vehicle was kept at a freezing 65 degrees. The air was filtered, sterile, and scented with subtle hints of cedar and premium leather. The chaotic noise of Lagos was instantly severed the moment the heavy door clicked shut. Obinna sat in the plush leather seat and began the meticulous process of shedding his disguise. He stripped off the filthy, oversized shirt and used a sanitized, hot towel provided by his head of security to wipe the grease and red earth from his face and hands. The crippled, mute sweeper dissolved, and the ruthless, calculating CEO of Eaglecrest Industries returned to the surface. "Report," Obinna commanded. His voice, unused for hours, was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of the frailty he projected in the market. His head of security, a former military contractor named Dapo, handed him a glowing tablet. "The surveillance is complete, sir. We have mapped the entire extortion network operating within Balagan. Sylvester is running a sophisticated racket. He uses his mother to launder the cash through 3 fake textile businesses, and he uses the street enforcers to maintain compliance. He has been collecting millions in undocumented tolls every month from the vendors." Obinna stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. And what of his new alliance? The bride's family. "Vivian's father is Chief Adebayo. He owns a mid-sized construction firm," Dapo replied, tapping the screen to bring up a new dossier. "Sylvester believes marrying into the Adebayo family will give him the capital required to bid on the new government housing contracts." Obinna's eyes narrowed. He swiped through the financial documents with a manicured finger. A cold, terrifying smile slowly touched the corners of his mouth. "Look deeper into Chief Adebayo's offshore accounts, Dapo. I suspect you will find that the man is building an empire on quicksand." "Understood, sir," Dapo said. He glanced at the rearview mirror, hesitating for a fraction of a second. "And the pregnant woman in Sector 4? Do you want a team to extract her?" "The conditions are lethal." Obinna looked out the tinted window, staring into the dark alley. The image of Chidinma, sitting in the mud, staring down Sylvester's cruelty with absolute, glacial stillness, burned in his mind. She was starving. She was in pain. It would cost him nothing to put her in a penthouse suite tonight. But he also understood that rescuing her now, before the trap was fully sprung, would alert Sylvester and ruin the execution. Furthermore, rescuing her would strip her of the ultimate victory she was currently earning in the dirt. She was forging a crown of iron, and he would not insult her by replacing it with unearned gold just yet. "No," Obinna said quietly. the word carrying a heavy, difficult weight. Do not extract her, but ensure the perimeter around her stall is secure. If Sylvester's enforcers attempt to lay a single finger on her, break their arms, and leave the package I requested at the drop point. Yes, sir. By the time the dull gray light of morning began to filter through the smog of Lagos, Chidinma was already awake. She had barely slept, her body too tight with pain to find rest on the hard concrete. As she shifted to stoke the dying embers of her charcoal fire, she noticed something sitting on the overturned plastic bucket beside her table. It was a thick, heavy woolen blanket, neatly folded. On top of it sat a large sealed thermos of clean, purified water and a paper-wrapped parcel containing roasted plantains and dense, nutrient-rich smoked fish. Chidinma froze. She looked up and scanned the waking market. The vendors were just beginning to unpack their wares. The aisles were mostly empty. 50 yards away, near the main drainage ditch, the mute sweeper was already at work, dragging his left leg, his head bowed, sweeping the debris of the night. He did not look in her direction. He offered no signal. Chidinma slowly reached out and touched the blanket. The wool was high-grade, incredibly warm, but it smelled faintly of industrial soap, carefully masking any origin of wealth. She picked up the thermos. It was heavy, retaining the heat of the water inside. A profound, overwhelming sense of being seen washed over her. It was not the loud, performative charity that people like Sylvester use to buy praise. It was silent, intentional protection. She did not call out to the sweeper to thank him. She honored the silence they had built. She wrapped the heavy blanket around her shoulders, the thick wool immediately trapping her body heat and soothing the violent shivers that had plagued her all night. She drank the warm water, feeling the life-saving hydration flood her system. But the quiet reprieve of the morning was shattered an hour later. Sylvester and 3 of his enforcers marched down the main aisle. They were loud, their voices thick and slurred, from a long night of heavy drinking and celebrating their newly extracted wealth. Sylvester was walking with a careless, arrogant swagger, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie loose. Tucked under his left arm was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. It was the master record. The book contained every name, every bribe, every illegal transaction, and every drop of blood they had squeezed from Balogun Market. Sylvester laughed loudly at a joke one of his thugs made, gesturing wildly with his right hand. He was drunk on power, drunk on alcohol, and entirely convinced of his own invincibility. He did not notice the muddy pothole directly in his path. His Italian leather shoe caught the edge of the broken pavement. Sylvester stumbled forward, his arms flailing to catch his balance. The black leather ledger slipped from his grip. It fell onto the red earth, sliding across the wet pavement until it bumped gently against the leg of Chidinma's broken wooden table. Sylvester's loud, alcohol-fueled laughter carried down the narrow, flooded aisle, entirely masking the soft, muffled thud of the ledger hitting the mud. He was too drunk on his own perceived invincibility, too engrossed in the performance of his petty authority, to notice the sudden absence of weight under his arm. He and his enforcers turned the corner without breaking their stride, their heavy boots splashing through the brown puddles, leaving the forgotten book resting against the splintered wood of Chidinma's table. Chidinma did not gasp. She did not immediately lunge for it. Survival in Balogun Market demanded the absolute suppression of impulse, a discipline she had honed over weeks of near starvation. She slowly scanned the aisle. The vendors were busy arranging their stalls, their eyes deliberately averted from the path Sylvester had just taken, terrified of attracting the enforcer's attention. 50 yards away, the mute sweeper paused his sweeping, leaning heavily on his wooden broom. He saw the ledger fall. He saw Chidinma looking at it, and for the first time since he had begun his silent vigil in the market, Obinna held his breath. With agonizing slowness, Chidinma shifted her swollen body. She draped the edge of her heavy woolen blanket over the table's broken leg, effectively concealing the black leather book from any passing eyes. She waited 3 full minutes, listening to the chaotic symphony of the market resuming its morning rhythm. When she was absolutely certain no enforcers were lingering behind in the shadows, she slipped her blistered hand beneath the blanket and pulled the ledger into her lap. The leather was cold, damp from the mud, and smelled faintly of Sylvester's expensive imported cologne. She opened it. Inside was a meticulous, handwritten architecture of human suffering. Rows of names, stall numbers, and dates lined the pages. Beside them were sums of money collected daily, weekly, and monthly. It was not just a record of extortion. It was a blueprint of Sylvester's desperate ambition. But as Chidinma turned the pages, her soot-stained fingernail tracing the columns, her sharp mind caught a glaring discrepancy. She had spent 3 years cleaning Sylvester's home office, quietly absorbing the mechanics of his business while he and Gladys treated her like invisible furniture. She knew how to read a balance sheet. Beside the massive extortion records were Sylvester's personal outflows, highlighted in thick red ink. The money was not staying in his accounts. Millions of naira were being funneled entirely out of the market and into a series of shell companies registered to Chief Adebayo's construction firm, Vivian's family. The pattern was obvious to anyone who knew how to look. Sylvester was not marrying into a wealthy empire. He was frantically purchasing his entry into Vivian's family with the blood of the market vendors. He was bleeding the poorest people in Lagos dry to fund a lavish, high-society wedding and to prop up his new father-in-law's failing contracts. Chidinma's pulse became a steady, rhythmic thud against her temples. She memorized the account numbers. She memorized the massive deficit at the bottom of the final page. She understood, with absolute clarity, that Sylvester was grossly overextended. If this ledger disappeared, his entire operation would instantly collapse. His enforcers would turn on him for their unpaid shares, and Chief Adebayo would cancel the marriage. But Chidinma also knew that knowledge without leverage is just a death sentence. If Sylvester realized she had taken the book, he would not hesitate to kill her and her unborn child to silence her. She could not keep it. A sudden, frantic shouting erupted from the adjacent alley. "Where is it? Find it. If anyone has touched it, break their hands." Sylvester's voice, stripped entirely of its arrogant, theatrical drawl, cracked with raw, unadulterated panic. The sudden realization that he had lost the master record, the only proof of the debts owed to him, the only leverage he held over the violent men he employed, had sobered him instantly. The psychological autopsy of a tyrant stripped of his tools is a violent, pathetic thing. His power was not inherent. It was entirely transactional. Without that black book, he was just a vulnerable man in a muddy linen suit. Chidinma heard the heavy, frantic thud of boots running back toward her section of the market. She did not panic. Her breathing remained shallow and controlled. She calmly closed the book. She wiped her soot-stained fingerprints from the smooth black leather using a clean, dry patch of her wrapper. With calculated precision, she slid the ledger back into the mud with her foot, pushing it slightly away from her table, positioning it precisely where it would look as though it had skidded to a halt on its own. She then picked up her blackened stick and returned to turning her roasting sweet potatoes, her face an impenetrable mask of supreme indifference. Seconds later, Sylvester burst around the corner. His chest was heaving, his expensive suit now stained with dark patches of sweat. His eyes darted frantically across the muddy ground, the whites showing in sheer terror. His two enforcers followed closely behind, violently shoving innocent vendors aside, overturning baskets of vegetables in their frantic, breathless search. Sylvester's wild eyes landed on the black, leather-bound book lying in the mud near the edge of the foul drainage ditch. He let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, a sound so entirely devoid of dignity that several market women paused to stare in disguised contempt. He lunged forward, falling to his knees in the filth, his Italian trousers soaking up the brown sludge. He snatched the ledger from the ground, clutching it tightly to his chest, as if it were a dying child, his hands trembling violently. He looked up, his breathing ragged, and saw Chidinma sitting just 3 feet away. "Did you touch this?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of immense relief and homicidal paranoia. Chidinma slowly looked down at him. She saw the foul mud seeping into the knees of his trousers, the sweat dripping from the tip of his nose, the desperate, clawing fear vibrating in his eyes. He looked infinitely smaller, infinitely weaker than he had the day before when Vivian and Gladys stood beside him projecting false royalty. "Touch what?" Chidinma asked, her voice perfectly flat, devoid of any inflection. She gestured to her swollen stomach and her blistered, ash-covered hands. "I am trying to keep a fire alive in the damp. I do not care about your trash." Sylvester stared at her, searching her exhausted face for any flicker of deceit. But Chidinma's face was a fortress. She had survived 3 years of Gladys's psychological torture. She knew exactly how to empty her eyes of all thought and present a blank canvas to an abuser. Sylvester sneered, his arrogance slowly returning now that his precious ledger was securely back in his possession. "You wouldn't even know what it was if you looked at it," he spat, standing up and brushing the wet mud from his knees with a trembling hand, trying to reclaim his shattered dignity. "Ignorance is the only thing you have ever mastered." He turned and walked away rapidly, flanked by his enforcers, his posture rigid with the lingering shock of his near ruin. Chidinma went back to her potatoes. She had not kept the physical book, but she had extracted everything of value inside it. She now knew the exact dimensions of his financial grave. From his vantage point near the main gutter, Obinna exhaled slowly. He had watched the entire sequence play out. He had seen her conceal the ledger, quickly process the information, and intentionally return it before Sylvester's panic could tear the market apart. It was a masterclass in risk assessment and emotional control. She possessed the strategic, calculating mind of a corporate raider trapped in the body of an abandoned, pregnant woman. The billionaire pulled his broom across the concrete, the rough bristles scratching against the red earth. His investigation into the extortion ring was officially complete, but a new, far more profound objective had materialized in his mind. He was no longer just going to reclaim the land beneath Balagan Market. He was going to give Chidinma the tools to build an empire on its ashes. The day after the incident with the Black Ledger, the atmosphere in Balagun Market felt perceptibly different to Chidinma. The oppressive, suffocating heat still beat down on the corrugated zinc roofs, and the air still smelled of fermenting cassava and diesel fumes, but the psychological weight pressing against her shoulders had significantly lightened. She roasted her sweet potatoes with a new, quiet rhythm. The physical pain in her swollen ankles and the sharp kicks against her ribs were no longer just symptoms of her suffering. They were a countdown. She knew the exact depth of Sylvester's financial grave. She knew that Chief Adebayo's construction empire was a decaying facade, propped up entirely by the extortion money squeezed from these muddy alleys. Knowledge changes the fundamental architecture of endurance. When a person believes their suffering is infinite, their spirit slowly erodes into despair. But when they see the exact expiration date of their abuser's power, endurance transforms into strategy. Chidinma did not need to fight Sylvester. She only needed to outlast him. From his usual vantage point near the intersection of the fabric and produce stalls, the mute sweeper continued his grueling labor. Obinna's left leg dragged across the uneven pavement, his ragged clothes absorbing the dust and grime of the market, but his mind was executing a complex sequence of corporate warfare. He had instructed Dapo to initiate the financial squeeze on Chief Adebayo's offshore accounts. The trap was set. But his primary concern was no longer just the destruction of Sylvester, it was the physical preservation of the woman sitting under the frayed blue tarp. He could not simply hand her a stack of Naira notes. She would know it came from the billionaire behind the disguise, breaking the fragile, silent trust they had established. More dangerously, sudden wealth in the middle of Balagan Market would instantly make her a target for the enforcers. Protection required a flawless alibi. 2 days later, the chaotic morning routine of the market was interrupted by the arrival of a pristine, white mobile medical clinic. The large, air-conditioned van navigated the narrow dirt roads slowly, its tires rolling over the muddy potholes with heavy, expensive shock absorbers. The side of the van bore the logo of a prominent international maternal health charity. It parked near the main entrance of the market, entirely bypassing the section controlled by Sylvester's thugs. 4 medical professionals wearing crisp, sterile scrubs stepped out, setting up a temporary triage station with folding tables and sanitized equipment. Word spread through the market like a brush fire. Free medical checkups, prenatal vitamins, and ultrasound scans for pregnant women and nursing mothers. The vendors, usually deeply suspicious of outsiders, began to line up cautiously. Chidinma watched from a distance. She had not seen a doctor since the day Sylvester threw her out into the rain. A dull, constant ache had settled deep into her pelvis, and she knew she needed a professional assessment, but she hesitated. Leaving her stall meant abandoning her small charcoal stove and her remaining sweet potatoes, her only source of income for the day. As she debated the risk, a woman in a white coat, flanked by a tall, broad-shouldered security guard who looked remarkably out of place for a charity worker, walked directly down the aisle toward her. "Good morning, madam," the doctor said, her voice warm, carrying a gentle professional authority. The smell of clinical antiseptic and lavender soap radiated from her, cutting sharply through the smoke of Chidinma's fire. "We are conducting mandatory prenatal assessments for all expecting mothers in the sector today. If you could please come with me to the mobile clinic." Chidinma looked at the doctor, then at the towering security guard whose eyes swept the alley with military precision. She instinctively glanced toward the drainage ditch. The mute sweeper was there, leaning on his broom. He did not look at her, but the subtle, almost imperceptible nod of his head told her everything she needed to know. The medical van was not a random act of charity, it was a calculated intervention. She slowly pushed herself up from the plastic bucket. The doctor immediately reached out, offering a steadying hand, her grip firm and respectful. They walked together toward the white van. The interior of the mobile clinic was a sanctuary of sterile, freezing air and blinding white light. The heavy doors closed, instantly muting the deafening roar of the market. For the first time in weeks, Chidinma sat on a soft, padded examination table. The doctor moved with quiet efficiency, measuring her blood pressure, listening to the child's heartbeat, and conducting a thorough physical assessment. "You are severely dehydrated, and your blood pressure is dangerously low," the doctor murmured, her brow furrowing as she documented the bruises and the advanced swelling in Chidinma's legs. "But the child's heartbeat is remarkably strong. You have been fighting very hard to keep this baby safe." The validation, delivered with clinical objectivity, struck Chidinma with the force of a physical blow. She swallowed hard, forcing the sudden hot sting of tears back down her throat. The doctor handed her a cold bottle of electrolyte water and a small sealed packet of premium prenatal vitamins. Then, she did something entirely uncharacteristic for a routine charity outreach. She pulled out a small, discreet black velvet pouch and pressed it firmly into Chidinma's palm. "A private benefactor sponsors our outreach program," the doctor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, her eyes locking onto Chidinma's. "He requested that this be given to you directly. It is not charity, it is an investment in your safety. Do not open it until you are absolutely alone." Chidinma's fingers closed around the soft velvet. It was small, but heavy. She nodded slowly, slipping the pouch deep into the waistband of her wrapper, hiding it beneath the oversized drape of her faded blouse. When she stepped back out of the air-conditioned van and into the suffocating, humid air of the market, the contrast felt almost unbearable. But she walked back to her broken table with a slightly straighter spine. The deep ache in her back had been soothed by a medical-grade pain reliever, and the cold water had sharpened her senses. She waited until the late afternoon, when the sun began to dip below the corrugated roofs and the shadows grew long and thick. Sylvester's enforcers had not yet begun their evening patrols. She sat with her back pressed against the cinder block wall, draped her heavy woolen blanket over her shoulders to block any stray glances, and carefully withdrew the black velvet pouch. Inside was not cash. It was a thick, heavy bundle of high-denomination supermarket vouchers, valid at any premium grocery store in Lagos, entirely untraceable and useless to the market thugs who only dealt in raw cash. Beneath the vouchers was a small, folded piece of thick, cream-colored cardstock. Chidinma opened the card. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and perfectly controlled. It contained only 3 sentences. Endurance is not meant to be a permanent state of being. The architecture of their ruin is complete. Be ready for the invitation. At the bottom of the card was a single embossed seal, a soaring eagle gripping a diamond, the exact logo she had seen on the heavy platinum signet ring worn by the crippled sweeper. Chidinma stared at the emblem. The billionaire was not just watching. He was communicating. The card was a formal declaration of war against her abusers, delivered by the man sweeping the gutters. She carefully folded the card and slipped it back into the pouch, securing it against her skin. She looked up across the muddy alley. The sweeper was gone. His plastic bucket and worn wooden broom had been abandoned near the edge of the foul water. His shift was over. The investigation was concluded. Obinna had left the market, retreating to the glass tower to initiate the final sequence of destruction. Chidinma picked up her blackened stick and turned the last roasting potato on the grill. The fire crackled softly, sending a thin stream of gray smoke into the darkening sky. She was no longer a discarded wife waiting to die in the dirt. She was a silent partner in the demolition of Sylvester's world. It required meticulous, exhausting calculation for Chidinma to utilize the premium supermarket vouchers without drawing the dangerous attention of the market enforcers. She knew that a destitute, pregnant woman suddenly flashing high-denomination certificates in the slums would instantly be accused of theft. She waited for the Sabbath, a Sunday morning when the chaotic machinery of Balagoon Market ground to a brief, holy halt, and Sylvester's thugs were sleeping off their Saturday night excesses. Before dawn, she washed her only spare wrapper at a public tap, scrubbing the fabric until her knuckles bled, desperate to remove the stench of the open gutters. She wrapped herself tightly, covering her hair with a faded but clean scarf, and walked 3 miles out of the district. She crossed the invisible boundary that separated the forgotten trenches of Lagos from the polished, air-conditioned enclaves of Victoria Island. The security guard at the sliding glass doors of the premium grocery store eyed her bare, calloused feet and swollen stomach with deep suspicion. He stepped forward to block her path, his hand resting on his baton. Chidinma did not shrink. She did not lower her eyes. She calmly reached into the black velvet pouch and produced a single, high-value voucher, holding it up so the embossed foil caught the fluorescent light. The guard's posture faltered. In the wealthy districts of the city, money erased all questions of pedigree. He stepped aside. Inside, the cold, filtered air raised goosebumps on Chidinma's skin. The store smelled of fresh apples, baking bread, and imported vanilla, a violently sharp contrast to the rotting cabbage and diesel fumes she inhaled daily. She did not wander the aisles marveling at the luxury. She moved with the ruthless efficiency of a soldier arming herself for a siege. She purchased tins of high-protein powdered milk, jars of roasted cashews, dried beef, iron supplements, and heavy, nutrient-dense loaves of wheat bread. The return of nutrition to a starving body is not a gentle process. It is a violent awakening. Over the next week, as Chidinma secretly consumed the rich calories beneath her frayed blue tarp, her body began to repair its damaged architecture. The dull gray pallor of her skin slowly gave way to a healthy, deep mahogany glow. The swelling in her ankles subsided just enough to allow her to walk without a pronounced limp. The child inside her grew heavy and active, kicking against her ribs with the unmistakable vigor of a life that refused to be extinguished. While Chidinma quietly rebuilt her physical strength in the shadows of the market, The architects of her misery were busy constructing their own gallows. To the vendors of Balogun Market, Vivian Adebayo was an untouchable princess. She walked through the muddy alleys like a queen surveying her peasants, her pristine linen dresses and imported perfumes serving as a brutal reminder of the wealth Sylvester had aligned himself with. Gladys treated her new daughter-in-law with an almost pathetic reverence, boasting to anyone who would listen that Sylvester was merging his future with a billionaire construction dynasty. But arrogance is often the loudest sound a sinking ship makes. What Sylvester did not know, what his mother Gladys could not possibly comprehend in her blinding greed, was that Chief Adebayo's renowned construction empire was nothing more than a corpse painted gold. For 2 years, the Adebayo family had not won a single legitimate government contract. Their offshore accounts were completely drained. They were drowning in a staggering deficit, desperately keeping up the public facade of immense wealth to stave off total social ruin. More importantly, they owed exactly 500 million naira in defaulted loans to a shadow holding company. That holding company was a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Eagle Crest Industries. The mute, crippled sweeper that Vivian had demanded be removed from her sight did not just own the market she stood in, he literally owned her family. Obinna held the legal deeds to Vivian's childhood mansion, her father's luxury vehicles, and the very clothes on her back. Vivian was not marrying Sylvester for love. She was not marrying him for his rugged ambition or his non-existent pedigree. She was marrying him because her father had seen the massive, undocumented cash flow generated by Sylvester's market extortion ring. Vivian was nothing more than a beautiful, fragrant parasite sent to latch onto Sylvester and drain his illegal tolls to pay the crippling interest on the debt owed to Obinna. Sylvester believed he was purchasing his entry into high society, entirely unaware that he was simply volunteering to be the sacrificial lamb for a bankrupt dynasty. It was a masterpiece of karmic irony. Obinna had not just trapped Sylvester, he had allowed 2 predators to lock jaws, completely ignorant of the fact that they were both sitting in a cage he controlled. The financial pressure of Vivian's hidden agenda quickly began to manifest in the market. The demands for cash increased exponentially. Chief Adebayo required a massive, immediate injection of funds to delay a foreclosure, and Vivian ruthlessly manipulated Sylvester to provide it, masking the demand as an essential wedding preparation cost. Sylvester, desperate to appease the woman he believed was his golden ticket, cracked under the pressure. He doubled the operational fees for every vendor in Balogun Market. The atmosphere shifted from oppressive to outright tyrannical. Enforcers no longer simply asked for the money. They overturned stalls, smashed jars of palm oil, and beat merchants who fell short of the new, impossible quotas. The wails of desperate women echoed through the zinc roofs. Chidinma sat in her forgotten corner, the heavy woolen blanket draped over her shoulders, observing the chaos with the cold, analytical detachment of a historian watching an empire fall. She watched Sylvester march through the aisles, his once immaculate linen suits now constantly wrinkled, dark circles bruised beneath his frantic, bloodshot eyes. He was no longer the smug tyrant who had kicked her broken table. He was a man bleeding out, swinging wildly at the shadows. 50 yards away, the mute sweeper dragged his left leg through the gutter. Obinna watched the violence escalate, his face entirely unreadable. He knew the breaking point had been reached. Sylvester had squeezed the market dry, and his enforcers were beginning to grumble about the increased risk and the lack of their usual cut. The foundation of fear that kept the thugs loyal to Sylvester was rapidly deteriorating into mutiny. The investigation was over. The evidence was secured. The trap was fully loaded. Obinna looked across the market toward Chidinma. She was turning a sweet potato over the charcoal fire, her movements steady, her back straight. She had survived the worst they had to offer, armed with nothing but patience and half a loaf of bread. The time for silent endurance was drawing to an abrupt close. It was time to dress the survivor for the execution. The suffocating tension that had gripped Balogun Market for weeks finally shattered on a Tuesday morning, replaced by a frantic, almost hysterical euphoria radiating from Sylvester's compound. The source of this sudden manic energy was a single, thick envelope made of heavy, cream-colored cardstock, sealed with gold wax bearing the crest of a soaring eagle. It was a formal invitation to the Eagle Crest Industries annual executive gala, held at the most exclusive five-star hotel on Victoria Island. For Sylvester, the invitation was not just a piece of paper, it was a divine pardon. He was teetering on the edge of total financial collapse, his enforcers nearing mutiny, his debts to Chief Adebayo mounting with terrifying speed. In his desperately deluded mind, this invitation meant that the elusive, faceless CEO of Eagle Crest Industries had noticed his aggressive management of Balagan Market and was preparing to offer him a massive, legitimate contract. Vivian, too, viewed the invitation as her salvation. She knew her father's shadow debt to Eagle Crest was due. She believed that attending the gala, as the glamorous bride of a rising market baron, would allow her to charm the executive board into an extension, entirely unaware that the man she intended to charm had spent the last 2 months sweeping garbage from her husband's shoes. The frantic preparations consumed them. Sylvester drained the last remaining drops of cash from the market's extortion fund to rent a fleet of luxury cars and purchase a bespoke Italian tuxedo. Gladys, refusing to be outshone, commissioned a heavy, suffocatingly elaborate lace gown woven with gold thread, determined to project the image of a wealthy matriarch to the billionaires she was about to meet. In her blinding arrogance, Gladys could not resist the urge to parade her impending triumph before the one person she required to feel inferior. Hours before the gala, Gladys marched down the muddy aisle of the market flanked by 2 enforcers. She found Chidinma sitting quietly beneath her frayed blue tarp, turning the last sweet potato over the dying embers of the charcoal fire. "Look at you," Gladys sneered, her voice dripping with a toxic, triumphant pity, still sitting in the soot. "I came to tell you that tonight my son sits with kings. Tonight, Sylvester signs a partnership with Eagle Crest Industries. We are leaving this filth behind forever, and you will die exactly where you belong, forgotten." Chidinma did not flinch. The high-protein diet of the past week had restored the steady rhythm of her heart and the sharp clarity of her mind. She looked at Gladys's elaborate gold jewelry, noting how the heavy bracelets seemed to weigh the older woman down, an anchor of debt disguised as decoration. "I heard you, Gladys," Chidinma said softly. She no longer called her mother-in-law. The biological and legal ties had been severed by cruelty. Only the truth remained. Gladys scoffed, deeply unsatisfied by the lack of tears, but she turned away, eager to begin her transformation into high society royalty. She strutted back toward the main road, completely oblivious to the fact that she was walking directly toward a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. As the sun sank below the smog-choked horizon of Lagos, the market emptied. The vendors packed their wares, hurrying home to escape the encroaching darkness. Chidinma remained at her stall. She knew her time in the dirt was over. The physical reconstruction of her body was complete. Now, the psychological reconstruction of her environment was about to begin. At exactly 7 o'clock, the familiar, pristine, white mobile medical clinic rolled silently down the deserted alley. It parked directly in front of Chidinma's broken table. The heavy side door slid open. Dapo, the towering head of security who usually operated in the shadows, stepped out. He was not wearing medical scrubs this time. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit, a discreet earpiece curled behind his ear. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a military professional, yet his eyes held a profound, unmistakable respect when he looked at Chidinma. "Madam," Dapo said, bowing his head slightly, "the CEO sends his regards. The vehicle is prepared for you." Chidinma did not ask questions. She did not express shock. She simply stood up. She took one final look at the broken wooden table, the plastic bucket, and the dead gray ashes of the charcoal fire. They were monuments to her suffering, but they were also the anvil upon which her absolute resilience had been forged. She left them behind without a second glance and stepped into the freezing, sterile interior of the van. Waiting for her on the padded examination table was a large, matte black garment box tied with a thick silk ribbon. Beside it sat a pair of low, elegant velvet heels, designed specifically to accommodate the swollen ankles of a woman in her 8th month of pregnancy. "We will drive you to a secure staging suite to prepare," Dapo explained, turning his back to give her privacy as the van began to move. "A professional team is waiting to assist you. You are expected at the Eagle Crest Gala in 2 hours." The transition from the squalor of Balogun Market to the hyper-luxury of the staging suite was abrupt, but Chidinma's mind processed it with the calm, methodical detachment of a queen returning from exile. The suite smelled of white lilies and expensive citrus soap. 2 female attendants moved with silent, rapid efficiency, drawing a warm bath infused with soothing oils to wash the stubborn red dust of the market from her skin. When Chidinma finally opened the black garment box, she exhaled a long, trembling breath. Inside lay a custom maternity evening gown woven from deep, liquid emerald silk. It was a masterpiece of architectural tailoring, designed not to hide her heavy, pregnant stomach in shame, but to drape over it like a royal mantle. The fabric felt like cool water against her skin, a violent, beautiful contrast to the scratchy cotton wrappers and heavy wool she had lived in. The attendant styled her hair in an elegant, towering crown of natural braids, keeping the makeup minimal, enhancing the deep mahogany glow of her skin and the sharp, intelligent contour of her cheekbones. They did not try to make her look like the fragile, pampered socialites of Victoria Island. They made her look exactly like what she was, a woman who had walked through hell and emerged owning the flames. When Chidinma stood before the floor-to-length mirror, the reflection staring back at her was entirely unrecognizable to the beggar who had scrounged for sweet potatoes. The bruised, exhausted girl Sylvester had thrown into the rain was dead. In her place stood a matriarch of absolute, terrifying composure. Dapo knocked gently on the door. "Madam, it is time." Chidinma stepped out of the suite and into the waiting, armored black Mercedes SUV. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing her in the quiet, climate-controlled interior. As the vehicle glided smoothly toward the 5-star hotel, navigating the glowing, neon-lit streets of Lagos, Chidinma placed a hand over her child. She felt no anxiety. She felt no lingering dread. The anxiety belonged to Sylvester. The dread belonged to Gladys. Chidinma only felt the cold, unyielding weight of justice rapidly approaching its designated target. The mute sweeper had laid the explosive charges perfectly beneath the foundations of their abusers' lives. Now, he had invited her to watch him press the detonator. The grand ballroom of the Victoria Island Hotel was a masterclass in sensory isolation, designed specifically to make its occupants forget that the chaotic, muddy trenches of Lagos existed just a few miles away. The air inside the massive hall was aggressively filtered and chilled to a crisp 62 degrees, completely neutralizing the oppressive tropical humidity. Hundreds of teardrop crystals hung from massive brass chandeliers, casting a fractured, golden light over the polished marble floors. A live string quartet played a delicate, sweeping classical arrangement in the corner, their notes mingling with the ambient hum of 200 wealthy elites murmuring over crystal flutes of imported champagne. The air smelled of roasted truffles, expensive French perfumes, and the sharp, clean scent of cold money. Sylvester stood near the center of the room, desperately trying to project an aura of belonging. He wore his rented Italian tuxedo like a suit of armor, but beneath the bespoke wool, his skin was clammy with nervous sweat. He held his champagne glass a little too tightly, his knuckles white, his eyes constantly darting toward the grand staircase where the executives of Eagle Crest Industries were scheduled to make their entrance. He was terrified. The bravado he wielded so effortlessly in the muddy alleys of Balogun Market was entirely useless here. In this room, he was a small fish swimming among leviathans, praying that his forged scales would not fall off before he could secure the contract that would save his life. Beside him, Gladys was a walking monument to overcompensation. Her heavy, gold-threaded lace gown was suffocatingly hot, and the massive, solid gold bracelets clanking at her wrists looked less like high society jewelry and more like gilded shackles. She was attacking a platter of smoked salmon hors d'oeuvres with the ravenous urgency of a woman who secretly feared she might never eat this well again. Vivian, draped in a sheer diamond-studded gown, stood slightly apart from them, furiously scanning the room. She was not here to celebrate her impending marriage. She was a debt collector in stilettos. Her father's construction empire was hours away from total foreclosure, and she needed to locate the CEO of Eagle Crest Industries the moment he appeared. "Stand up straight, Sylvester," Vivian hissed under her breath, not bothering to look at him. "Stop looking like a nervous subordinate. When the CEO comes down, you will introduce yourself immediately. My father's survival depends on this partnership. Do not embarrass me." Sylvester swallowed the bitter taste of bile in his throat and forced a stiff, sycophantic smile. "Of course, my love, everything is perfectly under control." At that exact moment, the heavy, towering mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Chidinma stepped over the threshold. She did not announce herself. She did not rush. She simply walked into the room, moving with the slow, deliberate, oceanic grace of a woman carrying a child. The deep, liquid, emerald silk of her custom maternity gown caught the light of the chandeliers, flowing over her swollen stomach like a royal mantle. The heavy braided crown of her hair framed a face that was entirely stripped of fear. The deep mahogany glow of her skin, restored by a week of secret, nutrient-dense survival, radiated a profound, unshakable vitality. She looked magnificent. But it was not her beauty that made the nearest guests stop talking. It was her gravity. In a room full of billionaires pretending to be relaxed, Chidinma was the only person who possessed absolute, genuine stillness. Gladys, pausing with a piece of smoked salmon halfway to her mouth, saw her first. The older woman's brain violently rejected the image. Her eyes widened, bulging against the heavy makeup plastered on her face. A sharp, embarrassing gasp escaped her throat, drawing the attention of the surrounding executives. "What is it, Mother?" Sylvester snapped, following his mother's horrified gaze. When Sylvester's eyes locked onto Chidinma, the champagne glass in his hand tilted dangerously, spilling cold, expensive liquid over the cuff of his rented tuxedo. The blood drained instantly from his face. His imposter syndrome, already stretched to the breaking point by the intimidating luxury of the ballroom, shattered into a blind, irrational panic. How was she here? How had the filthy, starving beggar he had kicked into the mud managed to bypass the heavily armed security of the most exclusive hotel in Nigeria? Is that the stray you threw out?" Vivian asked, her voice tight with a mixture of absolute disgust and dawning horror. "Sylvester, what is she doing here? If the CEO sees her, he will think we associate with street trash." "I will handle this," Sylvester hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, violent rage. He slammed his champagne glass onto a passing waiter's tray and marched across the polished marble floor. He intercepted Chidinma near a massive pillar of white orchids. He leaned in, his face contorted into a mask of pure malice, attempting to use the physical intimidation that worked so flawlessly in the market. "How did you get in here, you wretched parasite?" Sylvester whispered viciously, ensuring his voice did not carry over the string quartet. "Did you sleep with a guard? Did you steal a pass? I will have you dragged out of here by your hair and thrown into a police cell before you can even open your mouth to beg." Chidinma did not flinch. She did not take a step back. She looked at Sylvester's sweating forehead, his ruined tuxedo cuff, and the desperate, clawing panic vibrating in his chest. She felt no anger. She felt only the clinical, detached observation of a woman watching a terminal disease run its final, predictable course. "You are sweating, Sylvester," Chidinma said quietly. Her voice was perfectly flat, a glacial surface offering absolutely no reflection of his rage. The air is very cold, and yet you are sweating. Why are you so afraid? I am not afraid of a starving beggar, he spat, a vein pulsing wildly at his temple. He raised his hand, fully intending to grab her arm and physically drag her toward the service exit, completely abandoning all pretense of high society decorum. But his hand never reached her. A sharp, piercing electronic hum echoed through the ballroom as the master of ceremonies tapped the main microphone on the grand stage. The first step of the shockwave sequence triggered with violent precision. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, their bows freezing in midair. The heavy mahogany doors at the top of the grand marble staircase swung open. The ambient murmur of 200 conversations died an immediate, unnatural death. Absolute, suffocating, environmental silence slammed down on the ballroom. It was a physical weight pressing against the eardrums, signaling the arrival of an apex predator. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of ceremonies announced, his voice booming through the silent, freezing air. May I present the chairman and chief executive officer of Eagle Crest Industries. Sylvester's hand dropped. His head snapped toward the grand staircase, his face immediately stretching into a pathetic, desperate smile of subservience, ready to worship the man who held the keys to his salvation. Gladys stepped forward, smoothing her heavy lace gown. Vivian held her breath, her eyes locked on the top of the stairs. A man stepped into the light. He was dressed in a bespoke, midnight blue suit tailored to devastating perfection. He did not walk with a limp. His posture was rigid, commanding, and saturated with the casual, terrifying authority of a man who owned everything his eyes touched. He rested one hand on the marble banister. The light from the chandelier caught the thick, heavy band of solid platinum resting on his right index finger, a soaring eagle gripping a diamond. Sylvester stared at the man's face. He blinked once, twice. His brain, frantically trying to process the visual information, initiated a catastrophic system failure. The pristine suit, the perfectly groomed beard, the terrifyingly calm eyes, they all violently superimposed themselves over the image of the crippled, mute sweeper standing in the flooded gutters of Balagan Market. The second step of the shockwave sequence initiated a total, catastrophic cognitive collapse within Sylvester's mind. The sensory information entering his eyes, the sharp, expensive midnight blue suit, the unmistakable authority in the man's stride, the heavy platinum eagle crest ring conflicted so violently with his memory of the filthy, crippled sweeper that his physical body simply began to shut down. The hand Sylvester had raised to strike Chidinma went limp, dropping uselessly to his side. The champagne glass he had slammed onto the waiter's tray moments ago rattled with the vibration of the floor, yet Sylvester could not hear it. He could only hear the thunderous, frantic thumping of his own heart, a drumbeat of impending execution. He tried to speak, to offer some sycophantic greeting to the CEO, but his throat had constricted into a dry, paralyzed knot. Behind him, Gladys experienced a physical breakdown of her own. She stood frozen, the heavy, gold-threaded lace of her gown suddenly feeling like a lead shroud. Her eyes tracked the man descending the stairs, and as he stepped into the full, brilliant light of the chandeliers, the memory of the afternoon she had paraded through the market flooded back with terrifying clarity. She remembered sneering at him. She remembered calling him a dog guarding trash. She remembered the specific, venomous pity she had poured onto Chidinma while he stood just 20 feet away, silently recording every word. Gladys's knees buckled. Her hand flew to the massive gold bracelets at her wrist, clutching them as if they could somehow buy back the last hour. She staggered backward, her heavy frame colliding with a dessert table, sending a crystal bowl of fruit crashing to the marble floor in a spray of shattered glass and bruised pulp. Vivian's reaction was the most clinical, and therefore the most devastating. She did not focus on the disguise. She focused on the ring. As the daughter of a construction magnate, she knew exactly what that platinum eagle meant. She knew that Eaglecrest Industries held the notes on her father's defaulted loans. She realized, in a cold, paralyzing flash of insight, that the man she had demanded be removed from the market for being unsanitary was the sole individual with the power to prevent her family's total eviction. The champagne she had been sipping turned to ash in her mouth. She looked at Sylvester, then at Chidinma, and realized she had tethered her survival to a man who was already a ghost. Obinna reached the bottom of the staircase and did not stop. He did not pause to acknowledge the bowing dignitaries or the fluttering socialites. He walked directly toward the center of the room, the crowd parting before him like a dark tide. He stopped 6 feet from Sylvester. The CEO did not limp. He did not lower his head. He stood with the terrifying, absolute stillness of a mountain. He looked at Sylvester's sweat-stained tuxedo, then at the frantic, pathetic terror in the man's eyes. Obinna did not look at him with anger. He looked at him with the same supreme indifference one might afford a nuisance insect before a scheduled extermination. "The air in this room is filtered, Sylvester," Obinna said. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried with effortless authority through the silent ballroom. "It is cold, it is clean, and yet you are still sweating. Perhaps the weight of that black ledger you dropped in the mud is finally beginning to press against your chest." Sylvester's mouth opened, a pathetic, dry rasp escaping his lips. "Sir, Chairman, there must be a misunderstanding. The market, the security—" "There is no misunderstanding," Obinna interrupted, his tone as sharp and cold as a scalpel. He gestured slightly toward the grand stage, where a large, high-definition screen flickered to life. The ballroom gasped as a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs appeared. It was not corporate data. It was Sylvester. It was Gladys. The images showed them in the muddy alleys of Balogun Market, harassing vendors, overturning baskets of produce, and physically threatening the pregnant woman sitting under a tarp. The final image was a crystal-clear scan of the black ledger Chidinma had seen the pages documenting the millions of naira funneled illegally into Chief Adebayo's bankrupt construction firm. "You believe that Balogun Market was a forgotten trench where you could play God," Obinna continued, his eyes never leaving Sylvester's. "You believe that the people you extorted were invisible because they were poor. You were wrong. I do not buy property to simply collect rent, Sylvester. I buy it to protect the systems that feed this city. And you have spent the last 3 years poisoning those systems." Obinna turned his gaze toward Vivian and Chief Adebayo, who stood trembling in the shadows. "And to the House of Adebayo, let the record be clear. Your family's debt to Eaglecrest Industries is not being extended. The foreclosure of your estate and your firm begins at dawn. You sought to buy your salvation with blood money squeezed from market women. You will find that Eaglecrest does not accept that currency." Vivian let out a sharp, choked sob, her hand clutching the diamond-studded silk of her dress. The socialites who had been whispering to her moments ago stepped away, creating a ring of absolute social isolation around her. Obinna finally turned to Chidinma. Throughout the entire confrontation, Chidinma had remained in the third step of the shockwave. Glacial stillness. She did not gloat. She did not point a finger in accusation. She stood in her emerald silk gown, her hands resting protectively over her child, observing the destruction of her abusers with the calm, detached clarity of a judge watching a sentence be carried out. She was not a victim seeking revenge. She was the architect of the aftermath. Obinna walked toward her. He did not bow to her as a subordinate. He inclined his head with the profound, unmistakable respect of an equal. He reached into the pocket of his bespoke jacket and produced a thick, white envelope. "Madam Chidinma," Obinna said, ensuring his voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "You were offered to me as a joke. You were discarded as a burden. Yet, you were the only individual in that entire district who offered dignity to a man who appeared to have none. You protected the vulnerable when you yourself were the most exposed. Eaglecrest Industries values resilience above all other assets. He handed her the envelope. The deeds to Balagan Market have been reorganized, Obina announced. The land, the infrastructure, and the newly established maternal health fund are now held in trust under your name. You are no longer a tenant of that district. You are its proprietor. The enforcers have been removed. The illegal tolls are abolished. You will rebuild the market as you see fit. The environmental silence of the ballroom shattered into 1,000 frantic whispers. Sylvester collapsed. His legs simply gave out, and he fell to his knees on the polished marble, his head bowed in the exact posture of the beggars he had once mocked. Gladys wailed, a loud, ugly sound of total ruin, as security guards stepped forward to escort them toward the service exit. Chidinma took the envelope. She felt the heavy, solid weight of the documents against her palm. She looked at Sylvester one final time. She saw the sweat, the mud stains on his rented tuxedo, and the absolute hollow vacuum of his soul. She felt no pity. She felt no lingering pain. The bruised, starving girl he had thrown into the rain was gone, and the woman who had replaced her was already looking past him toward the future. She looked up at Obina. The billionaire CEO, the mute sweeper, her silent protector. "I heard you," Chidinma whispered, a faint, terrifyingly calm smile touching her lips. Obina smiled back, a genuine, private expression that never reached the cameras of the social media photographers. "I know you did. Shall we begin the reconstruction?" Chidinma nodded once. She turned away from the kneeling remains of her former life and walked toward the grand stage, the liquid emerald silk of her gown shimmering under the golden light of the chandeliers. The survivor was no longer waiting for an invitation. She was the host. 6 months later, the violent, chaotic trenches of Balagan Market had been completely erased, replaced by an architecture of dignity. The oppressive stench of fermenting cassava and open sewage was gone. In its place was the clean, sharp scent of fresh rain on newly laid asphalt. The chaotic maze of rotting wooden tables and frayed tarps had been dismantled, replaced by wide, organized arcades with properly reinforced zinc roofs, elevated concrete platforms, and deep, properly enclosed drainage systems. The terrified, suffocating silence that used to fall over the vendors when the enforcers approached was a relic of a dead era. Now, the market hummed with the vibrant, unburdened energy of honest commerce. At the very center of the market, built precisely over the patch of red earth where a broken wooden table once sat, stood a pristine, 2-story medical facility. The sign above the glass doors read, "The Chidinma Initiative for Maternal Health." Chidinma stood behind the floor-to-ceiling window of her private office on the 2nd floor, looking down at the thriving ecosystem she now controlled. The liquid emerald silk of the gala was gone, replaced by a sharp, tailored ivory suit that perfectly complemented her deep mahogany skin. In her arms, resting against her chest, in a soft linen sling, was her 3-month-old son. He was a quiet, observant child, born perfectly healthy in the finest private hospital in Lagos, entirely untouched by the starvation and trauma his mother had endured. She gently rocked him, her blistered hands now fully healed, the skin smooth and strong. The heavy oak door of the office clicked open. Obina stepped inside. He was not wearing the bespoke, midnight blue suit of the CEO, nor the filthy rags of the crippled sweeper. He wore a simple, perfectly pressed white button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The heavy platinum signet ring with the soaring eagle rested comfortably on his right index finger. He did not walk to the large mahogany desk to sit in the position of authority. He walked directly to the window and stood beside her, not in front of her to lead, not behind her to guard, beside her. The final structural reports for the Western Arcade were just approved, Obina said quietly, looking down at the paved roads. The solar grid will be fully operational by tomorrow evening. You have done in 6 months what the city council failed to do in 2 decades. Chidinma smiled faintly, her eyes tracking a group of market women who were laughing as they arranged their fresh produce under the new shaded canopies. "I simply asked them what they needed," she replied. "People who are fighting for their lives do not need complicated corporate strategies. They need clean water, safety, and a roof that does not leak. It is very easy to build an empire when you are not trying to bleed the foundation dry." The mention of bleeding brought a brief, profound silence to the room. The aftermath of the Eagle Crest Gala had been as swift and absolute as a guillotine. The revelation of Chief Adebayo's staggering debt, broadcasted to the highest echelons of Nigerian society, triggered an immediate financial panic. Creditors swarmed the Adebayo estate by dawn. The massive construction empire was liquidated within weeks. Vivian, stripped of her diamond-studded gowns and her imported French perfumes, was forced to flee the country with her disgraced father, their pedigree reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at high society dinners. Sylvester's descent had been even more brutal. Without the black ledger, and utterly humiliated by the public exposure of his crimes, his grip on the market enforcers evaporated overnight. The thugs he had employed to terrorize the vendors turned on him the moment the extortion money stopped flowing. He was stripped of his rented tuxedos, his luxury vehicles, and his false authority. Gladys was forced to sell every ounce of her heavy, suffocating gold jewelry just to keep them out of a maximum security prison, moving into a cramped, windowless room on the outskirts of the city. The man who had once kicked a starving, pregnant woman into the mud was now a ghost, wandering the very slums he used to rule, entirely ignored by the people he had once terrified. Dapo informed me that Sylvester attempted to secure a loan from one of our subsidiary banks yesterday, Obinna mentioned, his tone carrying the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Chidinma did not look away from the window. And he was denied at the reception desk. He lacked the collateral to secure even the application fee. Obinna turned his head slightly to study her profile. "You could have crushed him long before the gala, Chidinma. When you found that ledger in the mud, you could have taken it to the police. You could have destroyed him that very morning. If I had destroyed him then, he would have believed he was a victim of theft," Chidinma said softly, her hand gently stroking her sleeping son's back. "He would have spent the rest of his life believing he was a king who was unfairly robbed of his crown." She turned from the glass, looking directly into Obinna's eyes. "True power is not loud," she continued, her voice possessing the same glacial, unshakable clarity that had kept her alive under the frayed blue tarp. "Power is not screaming at your enemies or physically breaking their bones. Power is absolute, terrifying stillness. It is the patience to sit in the dirt and quietly watch your abusers dig their own graves. I did not need to destroy Sylvester. I only needed to step out of the way and let his own greed consume him." Obinna nodded slowly. The profound respect he held for the woman standing before him bordered on reverence. He had built a multi-billion-dollar holding company by aggressively conquering his competitors. But Chidinma had taught him that the most lethal corporate strategy in existence was simply allowing a corrupt system to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. "You are a terrifying woman, Madam Proprietor," Obinna said, a genuine warm smile touching his eyes. "I am a mother," Chidinma corrected gently, looking down at the sleeping infant in her arms. "And I will ensure that this child never has to learn how to shrink himself to survive the cruelty of small men." Outside, the market continued to hum with life. The vendors sold their goods without fear. The children ran on clean pavement without the threat of disease. The mud, the terror, and the suffocating despair were gone. Chidinma Okafor was no longer the destitute orphan discarded in the rain. She was the architect of a new sanctuary. She had survived the vulnerability trap, endured the sustained wound, and executed the silent reclamation with flawless precision. The architects of her suffering had been buried beneath the ruins of their own ambition, while she stood elevated, bathed in the clean, golden light of absolute justice. She had not begged for her dignity. She had claimed it, and in the end, that was the only currency that truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.